In the intricate web of global politics, certain alliances operate under the radar, influencing the destinies of nations. The United States Agency for International Development, established with the noble intent of fostering global development, has, over the decades, been implicated in activities that starkly contrast its stated mission. A significant facet of this covert agenda involves its collaboration with billionaire financier George Soros and his Open Society foundations. Together, they have been accused of orchestrating interventions that destabilize sovereign nations, all under the guise of promoting democracy and human rights. Founded in 1961 by President John F. Kennedy, USAID was envisioned as a tool to combat global poverty and promote sustainable development. However, from its inception, it carried a dual mandate. While publicly championing humanitarian causes, it covertly advanced US geopolitical interests. This duality has led to numerous instances where USAID's interventions have been less about aid and more about political manipulation. USAID was established in 1961 under President John F. Kennedy as part of the Foreign Assistance Act. This move was framed as an effort to consolidate various foreign aid programs under one agency, ensuring that US financial and humanitarian resources were efficiently distributed to developing nations. However, the real impetus behind USAID's creation was rooted in Cold War geopolitics. At the time, the US was engaged in a fierce ideological struggle with the Soviet Union, competing for influence over newly independent countries emerging from colonial rule in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Soviet Union was actively providing economic and military support to leftist movements and socialist governments, while the US sought to counter this by using financial aid as a tool to win allies and suppress any movements that leaned towards socialism or communism. Thus, from its very inception, USAID's mission was never neutral. While USAID publicly claims to be an independent agency focused on humanitarian efforts, it has frequently functioned as a front for US intelligence operations. The agency has worked closely with the CIA, the State Department, and even private entities like George Soros's Open Society foundations to fund activities that go far beyond development assistance. Numerous declassified documents and whistleblower testimonies have revealed that USAID has played a direct role in regime change operations. USAID has funneled money to opposition groups, media outlets, and political movements seeking to overthrow governments deemed unfriendly to US interests. In many cases, these efforts have led to violent uprisings, destabilization, and civil wars. Economic subjugation. By attaching strict conditions to financial aid, USAID has forced nations to adopt neoliberal economic policies that benefit Western corporations at the expense of local industries and public welfare. Espionage and intelligence gathering. USAID has frequently served as a cover for intelligence agents operating abroad, providing diplomatic immunity and logistical support for covert operations. Cultural and ideological engineering. USAID programs often promote Western liberal values, using soft power to reshape cultural and political norms in target countries, often undermining traditional values and national identity. The link between USAID and the CIA is well documented. Throughout the Cold War and beyond, USAID has been repeatedly exposed as a front for intelligence activities. In many cases, USAID projects have served as a means to funnel money, recruit local operatives, and conduct espionage under the pretext of humanitarian aid. One of the most infamous examples is USAID's role in Cuba. In 2014, an investigation revealed that USAID had secretly created a social media platform called Zunzuneo, a fake Twitter-like network designed to incite dissent and encourage protests against the Cuban government. The program, disguised as a communication tool for Cuban citizens, was actually a covert attempt to organize and mobilize opposition groups to destabilize the government of Raul Castro. Similarly, in Venezuela, USAID has been caught funding opposition parties and media organizations that have played a key role in efforts to overthrow the socialist government. US officials have openly admitted that millions of dollars have been directed toward pro-democracy movements, code for groups working to undermine President Nicolas Maduro's administration. Beyond political interference, USAID has also functioned as a key tool in economic imperialism. Under the pretext of providing financial assistance, the agency has imposed harsh economic conditions on recipient countries, forcing them to open their markets to American corporations, privatize key industries, and adopt policies that serve Western financial interests. This tactic, often referred to as debt diplomacy, ensures that developing nations remain economically dependent on the US and its allies. Countries that resist these policies are often subjected to sanctions, trade restrictions, or in extreme cases, direct intervention. For example, Haiti USAID has been deeply involved in shaping Haiti's economy, pushing for agricultural policies that have devastated local farmers while benefiting multinational agribusiness corporations. The agency has also been linked to funding projects that favored political elites aligned with US interests, while undermining grassroots movements advocating for true economic independence. Africa USAID programs across Africa have been criticized for prioritizing Western pharmaceutical companies and agribusiness over local solutions. Many aid packages require recipient nations to purchase American goods and services, effectively turning humanitarian aid into a tool for economic domination. Eastern Europe. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, USAID played a key role in orchestrating the rapid privatization of state assets in former socialist states. This resulted in widespread corruption, economic collapse, and the rise of oligarchs who were often more loyal to Western financial institutions than to their own people. A critical aspect of USAID's operations is its collaboration with George Soros and his Open Society foundations. Soros, a billionaire financier with deep ties to globalist elites, has used his vast wealth to influence political movements worldwide. His foundation, often working in tandem with USAID, has been accused of funding radical leftist groups, destabilizing conservative governments, and pushing an agenda that serves Western globalist interests rather than the people of the nations it claims to support. The partnership between USAID and Soros-linked organizations has been particularly evident in Eastern Europe. USAID and Soros-funded NGOs played a key role in the color revolutions that led to regime change in Ukraine, Georgia, and other post-Soviet states. Latin America USAID-backed groups, often with Soros funding, have supported opposition movements in Venezuela, Brazil, and Bolivia, attempting to unseat leaders who resist US corporate and geopolitical influence. Asia USAID has been accused of funding media and activist groups that have promoted unrest in countries like Myanmar, Thailand, and even India, where nationalist leaders have clashed with Western liberal agendas. Despite these glaring contradictions, USAID continues to present itself as a force for good. It issues reports detailing its humanitarian work, highlights success stories of aid recipients, and boasts about its role in disaster relief and development projects. However, this narrative collapses under scrutiny. While USAID does fund legitimate humanitarian initiatives, these are often secondary to its primary function as a geopolitical weapon. The same agency that provides food aid to struggling nations also bankrolls opposition movements to overthrow their governments. The same institution that builds schools in impoverished regions also facilitates economic policies that trap those nations in perpetual debt. The hypocrisy is unmistakable. The West, particularly the United States, brands itself as the global champion of democracy and free speech, yet it actively subverts democratic processes and funds political coups when elections do not produce results favorable to American interests. USAID was never a neutral development agency. It was conceived as a strategic tool of American power projection. While its official mission speaks of humanitarian aid and development, its actions tell a different story, one of political manipulation, economic coercion, and ideological warfare. The agency's deep ties with intelligence operations, its collaboration with globalist financiers like George Soros, and its pattern of supporting regime change efforts reveal an agenda that prioritizes Western dominance over true global progress. In an era where US influence is waning and multipolar powers are rising, the exposure of USAID's real purpose is crucial. The world is waking up to the reality that Western aid is often a weapon, not a gift. As nations begin to resist foreign interference, USAID's deceptive facade is being stripped away, revealing an empire in decline, desperate, hypocritical, and increasingly powerless in the face of a changing global order. Few figures in modern geopolitics evoke as much controversy as George Soros. The billionaire financier, through his open society foundations, has built an extensive network of influence spanning over 120 countries. He presents himself as a philanthropist advocating for democracy, human rights, and open societies, but in reality, his initiatives have been accused of advancing a far more insidious agenda, one that aligns closely with the interventionist objectives of the US government, particularly through USAID. This connection between USAID and Soros is not coincidental. It is a carefully crafted partnership where both entities benefit mutually. USAID gains an ideological cover to intervene in sovereign nations without direct governmental accountability, while Soros uses USAID's logistical and financial networks to extend his globalist agenda, often toppling governments, engineering social unrest, and reshaping political landscapes in ways that serve Western elites. This relationship has resulted in widespread destabilization, economic turmoil, and the erosion of national sovereignty across multiple continents. One of the most damning aspects of the USAID-Soros connection is the vast amount of US taxpayer money that has flowed into Soros-affiliated organizations under the pretext of development assistance and democracy promotion. According to reports, over $270 million has been funneled from USAID to Soros-funded projects over the past 2 decades. These funds have been used to prop up political movements, bankroll media organizations, and influence elections under the guise of civil society support. Some of the key recipients of USAID funding include Open Society Foundations, OSF, the global umbrella organization that controls Soros's funding networks, East-West Management Institute, EWMI, a US-based NGO that collaborates with USAID and OSF on judicial reform and governance programs, often accused of legal manipulation to undermine national sovereignty. International Renaissance Foundation, Ukraine, a key player in the Euromaidan protests, receiving both USAID and OSF funding to mobilize anti-government sentiment against pro-Russian leadership. Transparency International, ostensibly an anti-corruption watchdog, but one that selectively targets governments that resist Western influence while ignoring systemic corruption in pro-Western regimes. The pattern is clear. USAID provides the capital, and Soros's network executes the ideological subversion. This creates a system where nations that refuse to align with the US and globalist interests find themselves facing foreign-funded uprisings, media smear campaigns, and economic sabotage. USAID and Soros have repeatedly worked together to implement democracy promotion programs, a euphemism for orchestrating regime change. By exploiting existing social tensions, funding opposition groups, and manipulating elections, they have successfully destabilized numerous countries, leaving chaos in their wake. Eastern Europe, the color revolutions. The so-called color revolutions that swept through Eastern Europe in the early 2000s bear the fingerprints of the USAID-Soros alliance. These uprisings, presented as spontaneous pro-democracy movements, were in reality carefully orchestrated power grabs designed to install pro-Western regimes. Ukraine, 2004 and 2014. USAID and Soros-backed NGOs played an instrumental role in both the Orange Revolution, 2004, and the Euromaidan protests, 2014. The goal was to replace pro-Russian governments with Western-aligned leadership, leading to a prolonged conflict that culminated in the 2022 Russia-Ukraine war. Georgia, 2003. The Rose Revolution, which overthrew President Eduard Shevardnadze, was heavily financed by OSF and USAID-backed groups. The new pro-Western government immediately sought NATO and EU integration. Kyrgyzstan, 2005. The Tulip Revolution, another so-called democratic uprising, saw significant USAID and OSF funding funneled to opposition groups who eventually overthrew the sitting government. These revolutions were not genuine expressions of popular will, but well-financed operations designed to realign nations with Western geopolitical objectives. Latin America, targeting anti-imperialist governments. In Latin America, where leftist leaders have traditionally resisted US imperialism, the USAID-Soros alliance has been instrumental in funding opposition groups to destabilize governments. Venezuela USAID openly funds opposition parties, media outlets, and student movements opposed to the socialist government. The goal is to weaken and eventually overthrow any administration that resists US corporate control over Venezuela's vast oil reserves. Bolivia USAID-backed groups played a key role in the 2019 coup against President Evo Morales, a leader who prioritized nationalizing industries over allowing Western companies to exploit Bolivia's lithium resources. Nicaragua, the Sandinista government, which has resisted neoliberal economic policies, has faced continuous subversion efforts through USAID-funded opposition media and NGOs. By systematically destabilizing these nations, USAID and Soros create an environment where pro-Western governments can be installed, ensuring that multinational corporations maintain access to valuable resources and labor markets. Apart from funding opposition movements, USAID and Soros's network also exert significant influence over legal systems and media landscapes in target countries. This is done to create an illusion of democratic legitimacy while actively undermining national sovereignty. Judicial subversion. Soros's organizations with USAID backing have played a major role in judicial reform efforts worldwide, often with ulterior motives. These initiatives typically result in legal systems being reshaped in a way that allows Western-backed groups to manipulate the rule of law to their advantage. For example, in Albania, a judicial reform project co-financed by USAID and Soros led to a mass purge of judges and prosecutors, eliminating officials who resisted foreign interference. This effectively placed the country's judicial system under the influence of globalist institutions, rather than local democratic processes, media control, and propaganda. By financing media outlets and training journalists, USAID and OSF ensure that narratives favorable to Western interests dominate the discourse in targeted nations. This strategy has been used in Hungary. The Soros-backed Central European University and affiliated media outlets have continuously worked to undermine Prime Minister Viktor Orban's nationalist government. India USAID-funded think tanks and NGOs collaborate with Western media to discredit the Modi administration, painting it as authoritarian, while ignoring actual human rights violations in US allied states. Russia, countless US and Soros-funded organizations operate under the banner of independent journalism while spreading anti-Putin propaganda. This method of information warfare ensures that governments resisting Western influence are portrayed as oppressive, giving legitimacy to external interference and sanctions. The partnership between USAID and Soros represents more than just political meddling. It is a key component of the broader globalist agenda. Their combined efforts work toward eliminating nationalism by funding movements that promote open borders, multiculturalism, and supranational governance. They weaken national identities and make nations more susceptible to Western economic and political control. Economic control. By pushing neoliberal economic policies under the guise of development, they ensure that global financial institutions, such as the IMF and World Bank, dictate the economic futures of sovereign nations, erasing cultural sovereignty. Many USAID Soros initiatives promote cultural values that often clash with traditional societies, fostering internal conflicts that make it easier for external forces to assert dominance. The alliance between USAID and George Soros is a prime example of modern neocolonialism disguised as philanthropy. While claiming to champion democracy and human rights, they have left a trail of destabilized nations, economic devastation, and shattered sovereignties. However, the world is waking up to these tactics. Countries like Russia, Hungary, India, and China have begun expelling Soros-funded organizations and imposing restrictions on USAID's operations. This resistance signals a turning point, an emerging multipolar world where nations refuse to be puppets of Western globalist agendas. If sovereign nations wish to protect their political and economic independence, they must expose and dismantle the USAID Soros network before it dismantles them. Case studies: Destabilization in action. 1. Macedonia. Between 2012 and 2016, USAID allocated approximately $5 million to the Open Society Foundation, Macedonia. These funds were purportedly used to empower citizens and promote civil society. However, investigations revealed that the money was funneled into initiatives aimed at undermining the democratically elected center-right government, fostering unrest, and promoting a left-leaning agenda. 2. Albania. In Albania, USAID, in partnership with Soros's foundation, funded a judicial reform initiative. While presented as efforts to strengthen the rule of law, these reforms were criticized for consolidating power within the left-leaning government, effectively eroding checks and balances and compromising judicial independence. 3. India. USAID's involvement in India extended to funding organizations and media outlets that propagated anti-government narratives. Collaborating with entities linked to Soros, USAID supported initiatives that sought to challenge the government's policies, often under the pretext of promoting human rights and democracy. Mechanisms of influence. The playbook. The modus operandi of USAID and its affiliates often involves identifying societal fault lines within target nations, be it ethnic tensions, political divisions, or economic disparities. By funding local non-governmental organizations, media outlets, and activist groups, they amplify dissenting voices, create parallel power structures, and exert pressure on incumbent governments. This strategy not only destabilizes the existing order, but also paves the way for installing regimes more amenable to their interests. While USAID and its partners tout their mission as the promotion of democracy and human rights, their actions often belie these claims. By interfering in the internal affairs of sovereign nations, undermining democratically elected governments, and imposing external agendas, they contravene the very principles of self-determination and non-interference that underpin international law. For decades, the United States, through institutions like USAID, has positioned itself as the global champion of democracy, human rights, and free speech. This narrative has been relentlessly pushed through diplomatic statements, media propaganda, and international forums, reinforcing the image of the US as a benevolent superpower that spreads democratic values worldwide. However, when examined critically, this claim collapses under the weight of overwhelming evidence. USAID, often in collaboration with George Soros's Open Society Foundations, has repeatedly demonstrated that its so-called democracy promotion efforts are not about empowering people or upholding justice. Instead, they serve as tools of strategic influence, enabling the US government and Western elites to interfere in sovereign nations, manipulate political processes, and install puppet regimes that align with their economic and geopolitical interests. The hypocrisy is glaring. While condemning authoritarianism abroad, the US itself operates as a global imperialist force, engineering coups, suppressing dissent, and backing regimes that violate human rights, so long as they serve American corporate and strategic interests. Selective democracy, only for US allies. One of the clearest indicators of USAID's hypocrisy is its selective approach to democracy promotion. The agency pours billions of dollars into funding opposition movements, media outlets, and NGOs in nations where governments refuse to bow to Western pressure. However, when it comes to authoritarian regimes that serve US interests, the same voices that claim to defend democracy suddenly fall silent. USAID and Soros versus independent nations. Ukraine, 2014, USAID and Soros-funded organizations played a central role in the Euromaidan protests, engineering a coup that overthrew the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych because he pursued closer ties with Russia. The new US-backed regime that followed imposed policies favoring NATO expansion and Western corporate interests. Belarus, 2020. Following President Alexander Lukashenko's re-election, USAID-backed groups, along with Soros-funded NGOs, attempted to incite a color revolution, labeling the election fraudulent despite lacking clear evidence. Venezuela, 2002 to the present, USAID has funneled millions into opposition parties, right-wing activists and media groups aiming to overthrow socialist leaders Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, under the pretense of restoring democracy. Contrast this with USAID's silence on US-allied authoritarian regimes, Saudi Arabia, a brutal, absolute monarchy with no elections, no free press, and extreme human rights violations, including mass executions of political dissidents, yet never targeted by USAID or Soros for democracy promotion. Egypt, post-2013 coup. When the military overthrew the elected government of Mohamed Morsi and installed a dictatorship under Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, USAID continued to provide aid, ignoring the blatant human rights abuses. UAE and Qatar. These Gulf monarchies suppress political opposition, yet receive military and economic support from the US with no campaigns for democracy in sight. The conclusion is obvious. USAID and its backers only promote democracy in nations where regime change benefits Western interests. If a dictatorship serves US corporate or military objectives, it is ignored or even supported. USAID's democracy means regime change. Despite the grand rhetoric about empowering people, USAID's actions reveal that its primary function is to destabilize nations and engineer coups in places where the US wants regime change. USAID disguises its political interference by channeling funds into non-governmental organizations that push anti-government narratives in target nations. These NGOs operate under the banner of civil society groups, but function as soft power instruments of Western influence. USAID has been caught funding political parties, activists, and media outlets to shape election outcomes. When elections do not go in favor of Western interests, claims of fraud are immediately weaponized to incite protests. USAID finances media organizations that produce anti-government propaganda, presenting opposition forces as pro-democracy heroes while demonizing elected leaders as dictators. In places like Venezuela, USAID directly funded Juan Guaido, an unelected opposition figure who declared himself president with US backing despite lacking legitimacy among Venezuelan citizens. This strategy is not about democracy, it is about control. The goal is to install leaders who will open their economies to Western corporations, align with NATO and US military objectives, and suppress any movement toward independent governance. Another layer of USAID's hypocrisy is its manipulation of human rights discourse to serve its geopolitical goals. Whenever the US wants to justify sanctions, military intervention, or regime change, it suddenly discovers human rights violations in the target country. However, blatant abuses by US-allied regimes are either ignored or whitewashed. Western media, fueled by USAID-funded think tanks, constantly denounce Russia for alleged authoritarianism. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia, a nation where journalists are literally dismembered, like in the case of Jamal Khashoggi's murder, continues to receive weapons and financial aid from the US. The US accuses China of human rights abuses against Uyghur Muslims, yet supports Israel unconditionally as it commits war crimes against Palestinians, funds illegal settlements, and maintains apartheid policies. USAID never launches democracy programs in Israel to protect human rights. The US imposes crushing sanctions on Venezuela, citing concerns about democracy. Meanwhile, Colombia, where activists and journalists are routinely assassinated by government-linked paramilitaries, receives billions in military aid from Washington. This hypocrisy reveals that human rights and democracy are mere tools of propaganda. They are selectively weaponized against US adversaries, while ignored in US-allied states that commit far worse atrocities. USAID's interventions not only fail to create democracy, but often leave nations in ruins. The aftermath of USAID-backed regime change operations speaks for itself. In Libya, back in 2011, the US, through USAID and allied groups, helped overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, claiming it was a victory for democracy. The result? Libya is now a failed state with open-air slave markets, warlords, and endless civil conflict. In Iraq from 2003 to the present, The US invasion, backed by USAID rebuilding programs, destroyed the nation, killing millions and leaving Iraq under perpetual instability. In Afghanistan, from 2001 to 2021, after 2 decades of USAID-backed nation-building, Afghanistan collapsed the moment the US withdrew, proving that their efforts were never about democracy, only control. Rather than creating stable democratic societies, USAID's interventions have resulted in poverty, corruption, and endless war, proving once again that their agenda is not about helping people, but about keeping nations weak, divided, and dependent on the West. As the world shifts toward a multipolar order, more countries are rejecting USAID's neocolonial tactics. Nations like Russia, China, India, Hungary, and even African states are taking steps to ban Soros-funded organizations and restrict USAID's influence. They recognize that Western aid is often a Trojan horse for political interference, not genuine assistance. Even within the United States, skepticism toward USAID is growing. Figures like Elon Musk, Donald Trump, and conservative lawmakers have started calling for the agency to be dismantled, recognizing it as a corrupt institution that serves globalist interests rather than American taxpayers. The era of USAID manipulating the world under the guise of democracy promotion is coming to an end. The sooner nations reject its influence, the sooner they can reclaim their sovereignty and build independent futures free from Western meddling. USAID and its allies do not promote democracy, they weaponize it. They do not stand for human rights, they selectively exploit them. And they do not bring stability, they manufacture chaos. Their entire system is built on lies, hypocrisy, and manipulation. The world is waking up, and the downfall of this fraudulent empire is inevitable. Nations targeted by these covert operations have not remained passive. There has been a growing awareness and resentment towards the intrusive tactics employed by USAID and its affiliates. Countries like Hungary and Russia have taken measures to curtail the influence of foreign-funded NGOs, viewing them as instruments of external interference. This backlash underscores the erosion of trust in international aid organizations and highlights the need for greater transparency and accountability. For decades, the United States and its Western allies maintained a firm grip on the world, dictating political, economic, and military affairs through institutions like NATO, the IMF, World Bank, and USAID. However, this era of Western dominance is crumbling at an accelerating pace. The world has awakened to the hypocrisy, exploitation, and destructive interventions carried out under the guise of democracy promotion and humanitarian aid. From Iraq to Afghanistan, Libya to Ukraine, the West's failed wars, reckless interventions, and economic miscalculations have not only backfired, but have accelerated the rise of a new multipolar world order, one where BRICS plus, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and new additions like Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and others are reshaping global power structures. Meanwhile, the US and its allies are sinking under the weight of their own arrogance, economic collapse, and self-inflicted geopolitical disasters. The Western world is now in free fall, despised, humiliated, and weakened beyond repair. No one will come to its aid. No one sympathizes with its destruction. No one will help it rise again. USAID, along with its partners like George Soros' Open Society Foundations, was one of the West's primary tools for controlling nations. It promised development, but delivered exploitation. It spoke of democracy, but orchestrated coups. It claimed to fight poverty, but ensured economic dependence. The result? Nations that once tolerated Western influence are rejecting it outright. Countries like Russia, China, India, Iran, Turkey, and even former US allies in the Middle East have expelled USAID-funded NGOs and Western-backed institutions, recognizing them as nothing more than instruments of subversion. Former Western colonies are reclaiming their sovereignty. African nations, once bullied by Western economic coercion, are now turning to Russia, China, and BRICS, plus for trade and development, rejecting IMF and World Bank debt traps. The color revolution playbook is failing. The same tactics used to destabilize Ukraine, Belarus, and Venezuela are no longer as effective. Governments are preemptively cracking down on USAID and Soros-funded groups, cutting off Western influence before it can take root. The West, once feared and obeyed, is now ridiculed, resisted, and despised. Every major Western geopolitical venture in the last 3 decades has failed miserably, costing trillions of dollars, millions of lives, and irreparable damage to US credibility. Wars lost, trillions wasted, no gains. Afghanistan, 2001 to 2021. The US spent $2.3 trillion over 20 years, only to flee in humiliating defeat, leaving the Taliban stronger than before. The war claimed over 2,400 American soldiers' lives, destroyed Afghanistan's infrastructure, and left the region more unstable than ever. Iraq, 2003 to present. The illegal invasion, based on lies about WMDs, cost over $3 trillion, killed 4,500 US troops, and left Iraq devastated, aligning itself more with Iran rather than the US Western oil companies, failed to secure full control of Iraq's resources, and resentment against the US remains sky-high. Libya, 2011 to present. The NATO-led destruction of Libya turned Africa's most prosperous country into a failed state, with open-air slave markets and terrorist factions running wild. Instead of securing cheap oil for the West, Libya descended into chaos, another US-backed disaster. Ukraine, 2014 to present. The West spent billions funding a coup, arming Ukraine, and prolonging a war against Russia. The result? Russia took 4 Ukrainian regions. Ukraine's economy is in ruins, and European economies are crumbling under the weight of their own failed sanctions. Syria, 2011 to present. The US funded terrorist groups under the guise of freedom fighters, yet failed to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Russia stepped in, crushed ISIS, and strengthened Syria's alliance with China, Iran, and BRICS+. Instead of gaining influence, the US lost its grip on every region it invaded, leaving behind nothing but death, destruction, and hatred. As the US weakens, BRICS+ is rising as the new center of global power, challenging Western dominance in trade, military affairs, and finance. Russia defying Western sanctions, strengthening its economy, and leading military advancements that have humiliated NATO. China, becoming the world's economic powerhouse, de-dollarizing trade, and forging stronger ties with Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. India, playing a key role in BRICS+, increasing trade with Russia and China while ignoring US pressure to cut ties. Saudi Arabia and UAE, formerly loyal to the West, they are now joining BRICS+, ditching the petrodollar and shifting towards multipolar cooperation. Africa and Latin America, increasingly rejecting US influence, kicking out Western-backed NGOs, and securing better trade deals with China, Russia, and India. The BRICS-led world order is bringing an end to Western economic domination. The US dollar, once the global reserve currency, is losing its power as more nations trade in rubles, yuan, and local currencies, cutting the US out of global commerce. The economic collapse of the US and Europe, the last nail in the coffin. The Western economy is in freefall, plagued by inflation, rising debt, and collapsing industries. The US and Europe, after years of reckless spending, corporate greed, and failed wars, are now facing the final economic reckoning. The US economy, a ticking time bomb. National debt surpassing $34 trillion, spiraling out of control. Dollar dominance weakening, as BRICS+ nations shift away from using the US currency in global trade. Mass poverty and social decay, with record homelessness, drug addiction, and crime plaguing American cities. Failed sanctions on Russia backfiring, crippling European economies instead of Moscow. Europe's economic suicide. Germany, the EU's economic powerhouse, is falling into recession due to energy shortages caused by anti-Russia sanctions. France and the UK are facing protests, economic stagnation, and rising discontent against pro-US policies. Eastern Europe is turning against the EU, realizing that NATO and Brussels offer nothing but war and economic hardship. The West is imploding economically, politically, and socially, with no one willing to save it. The brutal, pathetic end of the West. No sympathy, no salvation. The US and Europe are collapsing and no one cares. The same nations that the West exploited, bombed and sanctioned will not lift a finger to save them. Africa remembers Western colonialism. Instead of helping Europe, African nations are embracing BRICS+. Latin America, long abused by the US, is forging stronger ties with China and Russia. Asia has outgrown Western dominance. The days of US and European economic supremacy are over. When the West falls, it will fall alone, with no allies, no sympathizers, and no one to mourn its demise. The empire of lies, destruction, and hypocrisy is collapsing, and the world rejoices. The West's inevitable doom. For centuries, the US and Europe ruled through manipulation, war, and economic coercion. Now their empire is dying, humiliated, defeated, and abandoned. USAID, NATO, the IMF, and the entire Western system of control have lost their power, and the New World Order is emerging without them. This is the final chapter of the West's story, a brutal, pathetic end with no redemption. The world is moving forward, while the US and Europe sink into irrelevance, consumed by their own arrogance, corruption, and failures. The West is over. No one will miss it. No one will save it. And the world is better off without it. Conclusion. The alliance between USAID and George Soros's Open Society Foundations represents a complex interplay of philanthropy and geopolitics. While their initiatives are often cloaked in the rhetoric of democracy promotion and human rights, a closer examination reveals a pattern of interventionism that destabilizes nations and undermines their sovereignty. As the global community becomes more cognizant of these covert operations, there is an urgent need to re-evaluate the role of international aid agencies and ensure that their actions align with the genuine aspirations of the people they purport to serve.